Greetings. I'm Howard Gardner. I'm speaking to you from the Harvard Graduate School of Education in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's the beginning of July, and I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with you talking about the work for which I am best known, the theory of multiple intelligences. And I have a rough plan for the next hour. We're going to start with the distinction between intelligence and intelligences, then introduce the major points of MI, multiple intelligence theory, some of the claims and implications of the theory, the term entry points, one of the ways of using multiple intelligence theory in teaching, how we could go about assessing people's intelligences, some remarks about unusual special populations, and then a very big question that I've been focusing on for the last couple decades: what should we use our intelligences for? Intelligences for what? And the answer will be for encouraging the good, but you'll get a lot more details if you stick with me. And at the end, we'll have a chance to summarize the hour's content. There's going to be a lot of information. It's going to come at a fairly rapid rate, but I hope that even as you fasten your seatbelts that you'll find it interesting and maybe even entertaining on occasion. So we all know the idea of stepping on a scale to find out how much you weigh, or taking a ruler to see how tall you are. For many years within psychology, there's been the notion that if you take a test called an IQ, or intelligence quotient test, you can find out how smart somebody is. So I hope you see the analogy between people's weight, their height, and their IQ. And this follows a perspective which is very widely adhered to in the West. And by the West, I mean United States, Europe, and parts of the world that are influenced, many countries in the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And the belief in the West is a single intelligence, which we psychologists call G, for general intelligence. It's highly heritable. That's very important. What that means is if you know how smart your grandparents are, you'll know how smart you are. That's what heritable means. And of course, that means you can't do much about your G, about your IQ. You're stuck with your grandparents. And we psychologists, hooray, we can tell you how smart you are by giving you a test, or maybe looking at your brain waves, or perhaps even swabbing some saliva to take a look at your genes. Now, I said the West because if you go to East Asia, to China, Japan, Korea, you'll find a different set of beliefs. In those countries, the belief is that how smart you are is a reflection of how hard you work. There's a saying in Japan, fail with 5, pass with 4. If you're lazy and insist on sleeping for 5 hours, you won't pass, but if you're harder working and you cut out an hour of sleep, maybe you'll pass. Now, as you can tell by looking at me, I've been around for a long time. And I can tell you, you should pick your grandparents shrewdly, and you should work hard. But since you can't do anything about who your grandparents are, that's been determined, the only effort you have vis-a-vis intellect is working hard. And so I think in many ways the East Asian view is much healthier than the view that we've cultivated for whatever reason in the West. So I wouldn't have to take up an hour of your time if I was just going to say, go give an IQ test and then you'll know how smart you are or how smart your students are. About 30 years ago, a little bit over 30 years ago, I developed a very different ways of thinking about it called the theory of multiple intelligences. And it's a new theory, or at least it was a new theory then. It was based on lots of different evidence from lots of different quarters. What we know about evolution of the species over a long period of time, as well as evolution of the brain of Homo sapiens, as well as the brain of other species. Examining unusual populations. We'll talk about this at the end of the talk. Individuals who are prodigious, individuals who are autistic, individuals who have very jagged profile. I mean, if the notion of IQ were strictly true, if you're smart in one thing, you should be smart in everything, and if you're not smart in one thing, you shouldn't be smart in anything. MI theory, which is quite intuitive, says that you might be smart in some things, average in other, and quite poor in a third area. I took a look at what kinds of skills and knowledge was valued in different cultures, both contemporary and historically, what was valued in the caves, what was valued in the fields of East Africa, what was valued in the South Seas. So it isn't just what you needed to do well in a modern Western school. It's a much more historical and a much broader, more synoptic view. And unlike most psychologists who look just at IQ, I deliberately looked at this whole range of findings from different disciplines. And for extra credit, I have 8 criteria for what it counts as an intelligence. And in my book, Frames of Mind, I actually run through many candidates and basically evaluate them in terms of whether they meet these criteria or not. And I have a definition. Definition is a lot of words. Talks about having the potential to process information in certain ways so that you can make something, fashion a product, or solve a problem that you're thinking about. And in each case, there's a cultural aspect because maybe the problems we need to solve today in the modern West are not the same problems that had to be solved 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago. But I have a visual which I think is the better way to convey what MI theory says. If you look at the left of the slide, the notion there is intelligence is one thing, like as if you had one computer in your head. And as I said, if the computer works well, you're smart. If it doesn't, you're out of luck. MI theory says we have a bunch of computers. And these computers deal with spatial information, musical information, and so on. And if you're like me, you might have a computer that works very well, a computer that works average, and the computer is not very good. So that is a graphic, a visual way of conveying MI theory. So let me now introduce with some slides the intelligences which I defined some years ago, as well as talking about my more recent thinking on the topic. The first intelligence is linguistic intelligence. It's the intelligence of an orator, a writer. This is a Chinese poet, Li Po. People who are good with language. This would be lawyers, writers. Second intelligence is logical mathematical. It's the intelligence of a scientist, a mathematician, somebody who deals with logic, somebody who deals with numbers. Now I list these intelligences first because if you take an IQ test, that's really what's being tested, is your linguistic and your logical mathematical intelligence. And that's fine because IQ tests are used to predict how you will do in a certain kind of school at a certain historical era. And clearly it's good to have linguistic and logical mathematical intelligence if you want to succeed in school. But we don't stay in school our whole lives. And the further away you get from school, the more your job, your life, your family involves skills other than school ones, the less important those two intelligences are, and the more important the other intelligences are. And I think there's at least a half a dozen other intelligences: musical intelligence, the intelligence of a composer, of a performer. Here's the conductor of the Baltimore Symphony. Fourth intelligence, spatial intelligence. It's the intelligence that you need to find your way in wide space, the way a navigator or airplane pilot would, or in more constrained kind of space, like a chess player. Fifth intelligence is bodily kinesthetic intelligence. As you can see, it's the intelligence of the dancer, or the athlete, or the sculptor, or the surgeon, people who use their whole body, as a dancer or athlete would, or parts of their body, as a craftsperson or a surgeon would, to solve problems or to make things. Sixth intelligence is interpersonal intelligence, very important intelligence for understanding other people, being able to work with them, people in politics, people in the media, people who are trying to sell you a used car. They're all using their interpersonal intelligence. Next intelligence is intrapersonal intelligence. Intra means turning inside. It's having an understanding of yourself, who you are, what you can do, what you want to do, what your skills are, what the obstacles are, what your motivational state is like. This kind of intelligence is very, very important nowadays because so many of us have to make our own decisions about where to work, with whom to work, what to study, what not to spend time on. And if you don't have a good knowledge of yourself, then you're going to make a lot of unnecessary mistakes. The eighth intelligence is the naturalist intelligence. As the name implies, it's the intelligence that allows us to make sense of nature, to tell one plant from another, one animal from another, one cloud configuration, one geological situation from another. And you might say, well, you know, that was important back thousands of years ago when we had hunters and fishermen or people working in farms, but who needs naturalist intelligence when we just go to the supermarket? But the brain's pretty smart, and if you think of our consumer society, how do we decide which pair of shoes to buy, which automobile to buy? We're using the same neural networks which thousands of years ago were used to survive on the plains of East Africa or on boats in the South Seas. We're using those same neural networks to decide which items to consume and how to make the best choices given our own set of values. So those are the 8 intelligences which I am now convinced exist, and I have the data which I think backs it up. But there are other intelligences I've talked about, at least informally, and I'll mention them here in that informal spirit. One is an existential intelligence. That's the intelligence of big questions. Who are we? Where are we headed? What is love? Why do we die? Why do we fight? You know, you might have a pet rat that has more spatial intelligence than you. You might have a bird that has a lot of musical intelligence, but I'm quite convinced only human beings have existential intelligence. Only we ask and ponder these big questions. One other intelligence, which I know most of you are educators, I've thought a lot about, is the pedagogical intelligence, the intelligence which allows us to teach things to other people. There are 2 things which have persuaded me they might be a pedagogical intelligence. One is that as young as the age of 3, kids can already teach. What do I mean by that? If you take a 3-year-old and you show him or her how to work some kind of machine, and then you ask that child either to explain it to a 2-year-old or to a 5-year-old, they'll do it very differently. For the 5-year-old, they do it rather quickly and just point to a few things and figure the 5-year-old, he's older, he knows more, he'll catch on. The 2-year-old, they'll be very careful, speak very slowly. They're teaching, even though, of course, they may not have that word. The other thing is, we all know in any field, let's say in performing an instrument or in being an athlete, you have 2 people who are equally good. You can't get anyone on a higher grade than the other, and yet one can teach very well and the one can't teach at all. That's pedagogical intelligence. So I think those might be intelligences, but I haven't got the scientific evidence that I have for the other intelligences. So I'm just giving them to you in a preliminary way. So that's the theory. Not one computer, not one intelligence, but a bunch of computers. We've got them all. All of us have these intelligences. That's what makes us humans, cognitively speaking. So as I joked, rats might have more spatial intelligence, birds might have more musical intelligence, but we're the species that has these 8 or 9 or 10 different intelligences. That's what makes us human. We've got those computers. But no 2 people on the planet, not even identical twins, have exactly the same profile of intelligences. If we knew in great detail exactly which intelligences you were strong in and how you use them, it would not be the same as anybody else. And we know that because even identical twins don't read in exactly the way, don't interact in exactly the same way. And when we take brain measures, fMRIs or PET scans, we see that the brains may not work in the same way. So from the point of view of science, we've all got these intelligences, but life's interesting. No 2 people have exactly the same profile, though presumably identical twins have more similar profiles than fraternal twins, and fraternal twins have more similar profiles than randomly chosen people from the planet. There are a lot of people on the planet. So those are scientific claims. How about some claims in education? The first claim is that we should individualize teaching and learning as much as we can. Since people have different intelligence profiles, and different brains, it's suboptimal to teach everybody the same way and to assess everybody in the same way. Now clearly, it's easier to individualize if you have a small number of students. Rich people with tutors have always had individualized education because the tutor can't say, oh, Prince Charles can't learn, give me Princess Anne. The tutor's job is to teach whoever they have so they'll be effective. But with the advent of digital devices, individualization, or personalization as it's often called, is much more possible than it's ever been possible before. So we're lucky that we can individualize education more now than we could have when we had 40 kids in a class and no media at our disposal. But there's something one could always do if one wanted to do and one knew how to do it, and that was to pluralize. What is pluralization? I begin with the notion that nobody can teach everything anymore. If they ever could, they certainly can't now. So we have to decide what's really important, and we have to focus in our classes, whether they're in person or online or even in books, we have to focus on things that are really important, things which are central to disciplines, which are central to occupations. And then we should pluralize, and that means we should present the material in more than one way. We shouldn't just talk about it as I am today because we have limited time. We shouldn't just have movies. We shouldn't just joke about them. We shouldn't just dramatize them. We should teach things in different ways. So here's an individualized class. Maybe the students are all studying the same thing, but they're certainly studying it in ways that make sense to them. And the more different ways we can give to them, the more we can pluralize, the better. So here's pluralization. This is about the Civil War. You can do it through books. You can do it through DVDs. You can do it through photographs. And of course, you can do it through contemporary history. There are many, many ways to help people understand the Civil War or the theory of evolution or what gravity is, any central concept in and across the disciplines. Now, I said important point number one, so it's probably important. And it may surprise you. I meet people all over who say, oh, Dr. Gardner, I love your theory, and I have a multiple intelligence class or multiple intelligence school, and of course, I'm flattered and I say thank you, but actually, multiple intelligence isn't an educational end in itself. Rather, you have to decide what are your educational goals, what are you trying to achieve, and then we can talk about how an understanding of MI theory and MI practice can help you achieve those goals. So what do I mean by goals? Here's a whole litany of goals, from understanding disciplines to learning the arts to getting high scores on the PISA or the TIMSS to being community service. Any school that said it was trying to do all these things, I'd say that's too much. Decide what's really important. And then if you decide, for example, that disciplinary understanding is very important, then you can use MI theory to say, well, what are some of the good ways to teach history? What are some of the good ways to assess history? It'd be very different if it's service to the community. That plays much more in personal intelligences. How can we use our personal intelligence to decide what to serve the community and how to go about doing it? So, in summary, you need to have educational goals. That's a question of values, and I shouldn't tell you what your values are. That's something for you to decide as a teacher, as a principal, as a policymaker, and then we can talk about how MI theory might help you to reach those goals. The second point is even more surprising, and that is nowadays there's a huge push to try to get scientific evidence to help you how to teach, to help you to tell what to teach and how to teach. And I'm all in favor of scientific evidence. I'm a scientist myself, but you can never go legitimately from a scientific findings to an educational practice, an educational recommendation. Because any educational recommendation inherently involves a value system. So let me use MI theory. Let's say Gardner's right and everybody's got 8 intelligences. What does that mean you should do? When I put out the theory, I didn't have educational ideas myself, but some people said, oh, 8 intelligences, we need to teach 8 different topics. 8 intelligences? Oh, we need to teach everything 8 different ways. 8 intelligence, we need to put all the kids who are strong in one intelligence together. 8 intelligence, we need to put kids with different intelligences together. Those all follow from the scientific claim that we have 8 intelligences. And even more insidious, this is sort of for extra credit, is when people say, oh, we found something in the brain, therefore we should do something in a certain way. I have not discovered anything where we should change practice just because there's been something discovered in the brain. It's valuable to know how the brain works, but in any brain finding, just like with MI theory, there's an infinite number of implications you can draw. So learn as much science as you can, learn as much brain stuff as you can, but never say, I'm doing this because of the brain. Let me use an example. People say, oh, art education, well, that's right hemisphere. We need to develop the right hemisphere. Does that mean if you didn't have a right hemisphere, you wouldn't do art education? Of course not. You would just find another rationale for it. So I love MI theory, and I'd love people to use it, but you can never say, well, I'm doing this because of MI theory. You've got to say, these are my values, these are my goals, this is what I want to achieve, and I think this theory can help me achieve it. And then you get a gold star. So entry points. This is one of the interesting educational ideas that I and others have come up with, and that is that if you decide that something is important, you can approach it in lots of different ways. And that allows us to be able to draw on the different intelligences. So this comes from my colleague, Rhonda Bondi, and she has an exercise which she does with 5th graders where they learn about different explorers. Brought along some slides of explorers. I don't know who they are, but people like, they have to learn about Christopher Columbus, about Ponce de Leon, about Hernando Cortez. They have a textbook and the teacher talks about it. And then what Rhonda does is she asks the kids to share what they've learned in different ways. They're supposed to tell a story about what they've learned, sing a song or create a song, act out a pivotal scene, a pivotal moment like when Cortez meets Montezuma, map out the course followed geographically, and then say, how would the explorer have drawn? What would he or she have done? I guess they were mostly men. What numbers are important to each? That's a very interesting. Could be the year, could be how old they were, could be how many soldiers they had. For Christopher Columbus, one answer is 3. Do you know why the 3? Because there were 3 ships. Recreate a time that you explored. That's about yourself. What did you do? Did the exploration work? So this is a very simple class that everybody learns about in social studies about exploration, but there are many, many ways, there are many intelligences which you can draw on, and that just complexifies your understanding of what exploring is all about. Now here's an example from secondary school. This is one I've written about in a book called The Disciplined Mind. And there I talk about how important it is for us all to understand what's true and what's not, what's beautiful and what's kitsch or ugly, what's good and what's bad. I hope you won't find those are alarming things to teach about. And as my truth dimension, I talk about the theory of evolution, because you can't do biology seriously unless you understand the theory of evolution. In the area of beauty, I talk about the music of Mozart, because I happen to think it's very beautiful. And then studying good and bad, I talk about the Holocaust. And to make it concrete, this is Darwin, who came up with the theory of evolution. This is, of course, Mozart. I deal particularly with the Marriage of Figaro, a great work by Mozart. And then this is a book about the Holocaust, which, of course, is an example of human evil. So what I do in The Disciplined Mind is I lay out 6 entry points, again, for how MI theory can help kids understand disciplines, whether it's biology or music or history. One is through narrative, through stories. Another is through quantity, numbers. There are numbers in everything you study. Through logic. Even the Marriage of Figaro can be laid out as a syllogism. So-and-so loves so-and-so, so-and-so doesn't know about this, therefore that's going to happen. Existential, the big questions. Where do we come from? Evolution is the only scientific answer to that question. In the case of Holocaust, why are people evil? That's an existential question. There are works of art in every area. There are works of art about nature and evolution. Obviously, the music of Mozart is a work of art. But there also are museums for the Holocaust. And when you go there, you can learn through artifacts about what happened. hands-on. You can act out, replicate, make things. You can perform a work of music. You can breed bacteria, which evolve very quickly. Or you can also do it, you can simulate it on a computer. And of course, you can have group work. You can have jigsaw. You can do things together. You can discuss, problem solve, joke, enact, and so on. So the point here is not that my examples are so vivid, but rather that when you want to study something important like the theory of evolution or the Holocaust, there are lots of different ways in. And if you use those different ways, two important things happen. First of all, you reach more students, because some students learn better from stories and others from logic and others from works of art. Second of all, and crucially, you understand better. Because what does understanding mean? Understanding means you can think about things in lots of different ways. Think about yourself, your family, your home, your school. You can tell stories about it. You can talk about numbers. You can have works of art. If you can explain something only one way, that shows your own understanding is very limited. And frankly, you're not going to be a very good teacher if you teach something in a certain way and the student says, I don't understand. Can you present it another way? Can you sing it to me? Can you enact it? Can you make a drawing? Can you make a movie? If the answer is no, then probably you need to work with somebody else so you can have a broader kind of understanding of what you're teaching. So entry points, I think, is a powerful idea. You don't need MI theory for it, but MI theory gives you a convenient way, either following Rhonda Bondi's notions about explorers or my notion about the disciplined mind. It gives you a way into pluralistic approaches toward understanding. So, especially in the United States, the first question is always, how do you assess the intelligences? And I don't favor paper and pencil tests for assessing the intelligences. The reason is simple. Paper and pencil tests are basically logical tests. And if you can approach something logically, you can usually figure out the right answer in a multiple choice, just saying, well, this couldn't be right, this wording is funny, and so on. I think the right way to assess multiple intelligences is to create a rich environment. I always say something like a children's museum, and watch young people move around in that environment, and by what they interact with, how they interact, and especially what they get better with, this tells you something about their intelligences. So many years ago, we developed an environment which we called the Spectrum Classroom. And in the Spectrum Classroom, we put out lots of interesting things for kids to play with. We watched those kids, and from those observations over time, we got a very rich notion of each child's profile of intelligences. So we had common household objects for kids to take apart and put together, doorknobs or meat grinders. We had musical instruments. These are Montessori bells, where kids would either recreate songs they'd heard or make up their own and then play with those melodies. We would provide clay and diorama materials, pipe cleaners, and so on, and have kids put together a three-dimensional display and tell a story about it. And this got at various kinds of intelligences, kinesthetic and linguistic and dramatic. We brought in lots of materials for kids to look at, either with a naked eye or under magnification, and describe and group together those elements, naturalist intelligence. We have board games. Board games give you numerical intelligence, mathematical intelligence, but they also, in young kids, give you interpersonal intelligence. Because if a young child cheats, that's actually a sign of interpersonal intelligence, because the child knows that you don't know everything that he or she knows. Now, after the age of 4, we discourage this kind of use of interpersonal intelligence, but you can't watch the political scene nowadays without realizing that lots of people are assuming that they can get away with lying. And this is a very interesting game where halfway through the year, we bring out blocks and we ask the kids to recreate the large classroom in miniature. So this is a test of spatial intelligence. But we also have little pieces of wood on which we pasted photographs of the children and the adults in the room, and we ask the kids who plays with whom, who likes whom, who did what yesterday, and it's a very nice measure of whether the kids are picking up interpersonal information. So this is an example of how you can create a classroom, kind of like a children's museum, where if you have interesting materials around and give kids chances to explore, you can tell a lot about their profile of intelligence. And of course, when kids are young, those intelligences can be changed. It's harder to change the profile when you're my age, but there's a big distance between these kids and me. In Denmark, there's a place called the Explorama, located at a theme park called Danfoss Universe. And they invited me to come there because they said, we've created a whole theme park where we can assess people's intelligences. And the people can be 5 years old or they can be 50 years old. Anybody can go there and they can learn about their intelligences. So I was intrigued, and I had the opportunity to go there some years ago. And sure enough, they have all sorts of games to play, games where you have to try to balance things, games where you have to try to figure out numerical codes, games where you have to build things of different shapes out of blocks, games where you have to move very adroitly so you don't trigger a loud noise if you hit one of those strings. That's for gross motor movements. This is for fine motor movements. Again, if the metal hits the other metal, you get an obnoxious noise. These are ways of getting at linguistic and musical intelligence. What patterns can kids hear? What can they recreate? And this is a very interesting game. Here, the kids have to move that vehicle around to pick up a rectangle, a little square, and move it elsewhere on the table. Now, what's interesting about this game is the kids have to work together. If they can't cooperate, then they can't move things. They each have a little dial they can use. So this gets at their interpersonal intelligence. Are they able to work together to solve some kind of problem? So when I went to the Danfoss Universe, they said to me, there's one intelligence we haven't figured out how to assess, and that's intrapersonal intelligence, knowing yourself. I said, well, it's hard to assess interpersonal intelligence. I joked, only your psychiatrist knows whether you understand yourself. But then I had an idea. I said, why not, before people go into the Explorama, have them predict how they're going to do on various kinds of things? And that will give you at least one measure of how much they know themselves. Whether they ever did that, I don't know, but it would be a way of assessing intrapersonal intelligence. So I want to talk a bit about, I've talked about the different intelligences and how they're reflected in different parts of the brain. But especially when you're dealing with young people, it's important to understand how flexible the brain is and to what extent really we can develop intelligences even if it didn't seem to be in the cards. This is the story of Nico. Nico was a young kid who had the misfortune of having intractable epilepsy. And so what they did with Nico is they actually extracted half of his brain. That's a pretty dramatic operation, and it's only done if people have intractable epilepsy. So you might say, well, if you take half the brain away, then there's no chance the person's going to be able to function at all. But amazingly, Nico is able to display a range of intelligences, and in fact, he's even be able to finish his education. And this shows you what happened to his brain. They actually removed half of it. It can't be more dramatic than that. And yet, at age 8, this is a work of art that he made. This was a painting that he made inspired by a photograph. These were portraits he made of other people. He was also a fencer, quite good fencer. And this is not the sort of thing any scientist would have predicted, but the point here is that when you're young, the brain is very flexible. The word that's used is plastic. You've probably heard that word. And the 8 intelligences, which usually distribute themselves across the entire cerebrum, can rearrange themselves in a much smaller space. That's a self-portrait done when he was about 20. And then this is a movie that is actually opening this week, so you'll hear about it. It's a movie called Life Animated, based on a book written by Ron Suskind. And it's a quite amazing book. It's about his son, Owen, who was, at age 3, was found to be autistic, and he was unable to communicate at all until he began to look at Walt Disney movies. And what his parents noticed was that he would want to see the same movies over and over and over again. And any of you who have kids or grandkids know it's same what happens with books. You read the book over and over again and you get very bored with it, but actually the kid is learning about the world through the book, so for him the book is a new experience each time. Well, this was what's happening with Owen with reference to Disney movies. He watched the movies over and over again because that was the way in which he learned about the world of emotions and experiences, the kinds of things with those of us who are lucky enough not to be autistic or on the autistic spectrum pick up naturally, so to speak, just by living in the world. But the Disney movies exaggerated those emotions so that they became clearer to a child who himself had difficulty picking up cues from other people. As you'll see if you go to the movie, Owen is now 26 and he's quite functional. He can imitate all of the voices from all the movies, and it's in imitating those voices that he comes to understand what envy is about, what love is about, what pride is about, and it's sort of as a bonus he does it with the voices, showing that he has some, might say, acting intelligence as well. So we're coming toward the end of the talk, and when you say intelligence is inherently amoral, what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have linguistic intelligence. Sounds like a great thing. And Goethe, the German poet, had great linguistic intelligence. He wrote wonderful drama and poetry. But Joseph Goebbels, who was the propagandist under Hitler, also was very good with the German language. So you can use your linguistic intelligence to do things which we value, great art. You can also use your linguistic intelligence to encourage genocide. Let's take interpersonal intelligence. Take two people who were on the scene in the world in recent years, Nelson Mandela and Slobodan Milosevic. Nelson Mandela, probably the most admired person in the world, used his interpersonal intelligence to bring people together, to take a warring nation and make it into one nation with much less trauma and much less killing than anybody would have expected. He was using his interpersonal intelligence in a very positive way. Slobodan Milosevic was a Serbian leader. He developed the notion of ethnic cleansing, and if you weren't a Serb of the right religion and the right ethnicity, then you shouldn't be allowed to live. And he was very persuasive. He led Serbs in military victories in the 1990s, and he was using his interpersonal intelligence in ways that were wicked. And so when I say intelligence is inherently immoral, what I mean, intelligence is just a computer. And just like a computer can help people get along or it can turn into bashing of other people, bullying of other people, so too an intelligence doesn't have any kind of a moral tag. So with colleagues, I've been interested in how we use our intelligences in a positive way. And this has been done through a project called the Good Work Project with two colleagues initially, Bill Damon and Mike Csikszentmihalyi. And now we have many people working on this in many laboratories, and we've shortened the name to the Good Project. But good work is exemplified by certain people who I think are widely admired. This is Jonas Salk, the scientist who created the vaccine which was used to eradicate polio. I think of Jonas Salk as being a good worker. This is Dame Aung Suu Kyi, who is the Burmese leader, the Myanmar leader, who was under house arrest for many years but has emerged recently as a political leader and is trying to bring some democracy to that very troubled part of Southeast Asia. Nelson Mandela, again, greatly admired for how he used his intelligences, how his work was in good direction. And the person whom I personally think was the most important human being in the last 1,000 years, Mahatma Gandhi, who understood that people were going to disagree, but that we need to learn to disagree nonviolently. And Gandhi not only helped India to become an independent nation, but was a tremendous role model for Mandela, for Martin Luther King Jr., for President Obama, and other people who want to try to do things in a less violent way. So these are people who are good workers. Probably none of them is perfect, but probably they would stand for most people's list of good workers. So what is a good worker? A good worker is somebody who has three qualities. He or she knows what they're doing. They are technically excellent. They like their work. They look forward to it. It's engaging. It is meaningful for them. And this is what I focused on in my own studies. They carry out that work in an ethical way. So let's think about teachers. A good worker teacher would be somebody who knows this topic, her topic, is well informed, keeps up, is excellent in the mastery of whatever they're teaching. Number two, they like their work. They look forward to it. They look forward to Monday. They don't dread it. They might like the weekend, but that doesn't mean they don't want to go back the next day. And you know, if your work is not meaningful, it's very, very hard to continue doing it, let alone to do it well. And then again, what I'm most interested in, carrying out your work in an ethical way. Now, what I mean by ethical, you might say, well, of course, teachers are ethical, but ethical dilemmas come up all the time, and how you deal with those dilemmas is not easy. So let me give you a couple of examples. You have a child in your class who's very needy, who has lots of problems, and could take up all your time. You've got 25 other kids in the class. How do you divide your time between the kid who's really needy, who needs a role model, who needs your love and needs your attention, and 25 other kids who may need it as well? That's an ethical problem. And there's no easy answer to it, but you really work very hard to try to do the right thing. You don't always succeed. When you fail, you try to do a better job the next time. Another ethical problem comes out of our good work research. There was a teacher, chemistry teacher, an excellent teacher. Students loved the teacher, but the teacher was a tough grader. And his students were not getting prizes in school because their averages were not as high. So they went to Mike, the name we gave him, and they said, Mike, you should give higher grades. We love you, but we're not doing well in the competition. And this is an ethical dilemma because Mike was trying to give kids the grades that they deserved and not the grades they wanted to have. So don't assume that just because you're a teacher, you're ethical. Ethical things come up all the time. I'm a teacher and they come up all the time. What do I do when I think a student is getting a doctoral degree but should never be a scholar? How do I handle that? That's a very difficult ethical dilemma, and there's no right answer. You just try to do the best you can. So in good work, we look at people who use their intelligences to learn the matter well, to find meaning in what they do, and to try to be ethical. And this is a graphic that we have. It has the 3 E's: excellence, engagement, and ethics. And we call this the triple helix because you all know the double helix of DNA, our genetic, physical, well, actually our whole being. But ENA is what you need to be a good worker. And you can't be a good worker if you're just excellent or just engaged or just ethical. You need to have that combination. And I just came up with this actually yesterday in conversation, so you're the first people who will hear it. What are we trying to do in school other than get kids to master their subject matter? We're trying to get ENA into their DNA. We're trying from a very early age to get them to want to be excellent and engaged and ethical, so it's just part of their being. Because the best predictor of who's going to be a good worker when they're 50 or 40 are the people who grew up that way. And my own belief, though this is a belief rather than something I could prove to you, that the last chance people have to be good workers is probably the first job, the first real job they have. Because if you were inclined not to be a good worker, but you go to the first job and you really want to do well and you really want to be able to stay there and advance, you get your act together. But if you've been inclined not to be a good worker, not to be particularly engaged, not to be particularly ethical, not to be particularly excellent, and that's tolerated at your first job, it'll probably never get ENA into your DNA. But the time is not to start at your first job, the time is to start early in school. And the school I would want my grandchildren to go to is a school where they pursue good work. They want their kids to be knowledgeable, ethical, and engaged. And they want them to be good citizens. And who's a good citizen? A good citizen is somebody who knows the law, knows the rules, knows the regulation, cares, votes, petitions, tweets, whatever, and tries to do the right thing. You can have a citizen who's well-informed and very noisy, but they're just promoting themselves. And that does not make a civis. That does not make a society. That just makes self-aggrandizement, something we have, alas, a lot of in our country today. So I'm getting a bit sermonic, which is probably a sign that we should draw to a close, but intelligences aren't enough. It's what you use them for that is so important. So we started with the standard view of intelligence. Give somebody a test, you know how smart they are. They're going to be smart or dumb in everything, and that's their life chance because it came from their grandparents, and there's nothing you can do about it. Why do I say grandparents rather than parents? Well, because of course, when you look at the genes of all of your grandparents, you're more likely to find out what you're going to be like than if you just look at your parents, who only have a certain amount from each grandparent. So as a scholar many years ago, I realized that this was a very limited view of intellect. So I spent a lot of years reviewing a lot of findings from biology, evolution, genetics, anthropology, history, prehistory. I set up a set of criteria for what comes up as intelligence. I had a definition about solving problems and making things that are valued, and that became the intellectual basis for MI theory. I then listed for you the 8 intelligences. Schools focus a lot on language and logic, but as we said in the last part of the talk, we want them to focus on the arts. We want them to focus on interpersonal knowledge, interpersonal knowledge. School can't just be a language logic machine, or we're going to get people who are unethical and uncivic. So I think there are at least 8 intelligences. There may be a few more, but what really is important is not have I got the right list, but rather that we break the notion down that intelligence is just one thing, and that it determines your fate. That's just a bad point of view. So I talked about the scientific implications, that we all have these intelligences, that's what makes us human, but we're different, and no two people have exactly the same profile. And then the educational implications, namely, we should know what our goals are, and then we can see how MI theory can help us achieve those goals. I talked a bit about individuation, trying to have each person learn and show what they know in a way that makes sense for them, about pluralization, presenting the same ideas in many different ways, and that entry points is one way of doing that. I talked about entry points for the Explorer lesson, where you have many different ways in which kids can talk about, show what it is that they understand. And then I used the examples from the disciplined mind, many different ways to learn and to show what you've learned about important issues in history, in science, in the arts. Then we talked about assessment, popped it down in the list, because everybody wants to know how to assess intelligences. And my point of view there is, don't use a paper and pencil test. Create a rich environment. Watch young people navigate it. When it comes to adults, I used to say, fly to Australia, and then parachute to the center of Sydney, to the outback, and to the Great Barrier Reef, and just watch people for a few hours. You'll know what intelligences they have and which ones they lack. Or you can go to Denmark, or you can just go on a vacation with your family and just watch who does what and who does what well, and so on. Brain plasticity, one of the amazing things we've learned in recent years is that even if you lose significant parts of the brain, you can still develop a range of intelligences. And even if you have a significant handicap, like being on the autistic spectrum, if you use media well, you can enhance intelligences which would seem to be very limited in the case of autism, linguistic and personal intelligences. Finally, and this was sort of the moral of the story, we've got this set of intelligences and we should develop as many of them as possible. Life is short, so we can't develop them all to a high degree. But at the end of the day, it's what are we using the intelligences for? And if we don't use them for good purposes, then it's just as well not have them at all. So here's a closing thought from a wise American, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. What Dr. King said, intelligence plus character, that's the mark of a true education. I've been talking about intelligences, the range of intelligences, but character is what you use those intelligences for. Are you a good worker or a good citizen? And only if you can answer that question in a positive way do you really deserve to be called a fully developed human being. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that this ride was comfortable for you. And if you want to know more, you can go to my own website, howardgardner.com. You can go to multipleintelligences.com, where we have a lot more information about MI. If you want to know about the Good Project, that's the more recent work, goodproject.org. And as some of you will know, I am a founding member of an organization called Project Zero at Harvard. We're about to have our 50th anniversary next year, and a lot of the educational materials that we've developed are described at pz.harvard.edu, as well as books that we've written and institutes that we have. We'll have 2 institutes this summer and an institute in Washington, D.C. in October. And so even though I only talked to you for an hour, there's plenty to do if you want to follow up.